There are often major turning points in a diplomacy game decided in a split second that completely change the outcome of a game. In this game, I look really closely at those key decisions and how they happened using a blind commentary from the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, combined with an after-action report by my opponents, and of course, by sharing some of my own thought process. This is Legendary Tactics. This game was my first virtual face-to-face game, and I was surprised by some of the decisions I made. This video will be a deep dive into what went on in my first game of my first tournament, the Liberty Cup 2020. It'll be a thorough autopsy of both sides of a diplomacy game from within and without. The DBN is doing some great work covering diplomacy, and there's a link to their channel in the description. My thanks to them for letting me use their commentary. So a Reddit user named Jax hypothesized that there are two ways to win at diplomacy. The first is to appear to be the strongest player with whom everybody wants to ally, or the other way is to appear to be the weakest player whom nobody considers a threat. So I decided going into this game that I was going to try to do both. I wanted to have the lead in supply centers for the whole game, but I didn't want to appear to be either threatening or strong. So this is why at times my gameplay may have perplexed the commentators. I wasn't aware who my opponents were when we started this game, but it turned out that there were some very skilled players in this match. Let's start by looking at the openings. One important decision that Germany often has to make is whether to let Russia into Sweden, and many people here were encouraging Germany, played by Ben Kelman, to block me, and that would have been ideal for them, of course, because it immediately sets Russia and Germany up for some conflict.
No bounce in Sweden. That's what I see.
This is such an innocuous moment, but it really shifted the game later. Since this was my first virtual face-to-face game, I was learning the etiquette of leaping into rooms to chat with people. But one technique that Natty Schaefer in Austria used that influenced one of my later key decisions was to encourage Germany to let me in. It was a very minor interjection, but I think it's what helped tip Germany to let me have that build, which then resulted in a great start to the interactions between the three of us. George Zhang had a really unconventional opening for Turkey here. The commentators were somewhat perplexed.
Why do you think George and Turkey went to Syria here instead of just cycling up to Ankara?
I assume it's well, it's an interesting question. I haven't really seen this opening before. I would need a bit more time to think about it. Is it something you see a lot in face-to-face or not?
No.
No.
The only thing I can think of is that it's a long-term discouragement of the Lepanto setup.
George's motivation for this decision was, and he says, I move my SMY to Syria because that way I can build Fleet Ankara if Russia betrays the Black Sea DMZ and build a fleet SMY otherwise. In addition, from a Russian perspective, that de-escalates any tension, and it shows me that he wants to work together. So overall, a perplexing play from the outside, but one that actually makes sense. So one order that really helped me out quite a bit here was the Italian invasion into Tyrolia. This really put pressure on Austria because he's suddenly surrounded by three potentially hostile forces. So in this position, he needs to bring me on side to make it a 2v2, and I'll show you how he does that in a minute. But first, Paul Angel, playing Italy, says, the move in Tyrolia was really two factors coming into play. The first factor was that I wanted to shake up the opening game. It was either a move into Piedmont or Tyr, and I figured that Tyrolia was more likely to give me a supply point. So this is where the commentators ask whose board position is the best. So take a moment, look at the board, and decide for yourself here before I offer their thoughts.
Well, who would you most want to be on this board? Marcus, we'll start with you first.
I think probably France. I mean, I like playing France anyway, so that's probably biasing it a bit, but they've got options here, and all of their neighbors seem to be a little weak. Obviously, the German building two armies could be a problem for France if an England-Germany alliance happens, but then you would have expected them to build Fleet Berlin to take Sweden off of the Russians, so...
It's a nice gift to both Russia and England, isn't it, to not have to deal with a fleet in there.
I don't think there's an especially powerful country anywhere on the board just yet.
Yeah, I probably should save this question for O2. In fact, why don't we do that? We'll let you off the hook here, Siobhan, unless you're burning to jump in on that.
I mean, yeah, it's a little early to do that, but I think the Russian.
Yeah, actually, there's no fleet in Barents, there's no army in Norway, there's no army in Armenia, there's no army in Galicia.
There's no clear alliance structure in the West yet, so you've got a lot of options. You've got a good friend in Turkey who will, unless things change drastically, continue to push west with you.
Good choice, Siobhan, good choice. So France is often targeted very early simply because they have the best odds of winning the game, and this is actually something that a lot of players use, myself included, early on to direct aggression towards the Frenchmen, and this game is no exception. You can see that Germany and England are both going all in against him. France made a bad guess here and committed against the Italian, so he's way out of position. I should point out the arrangement we have in the north. Sam Feldman, who's playing England, made some important symbolic gestures and I reciprocated. So he landed a fleet in Norway, which limits his options against me in the north. Likewise, I didn't want to leave a hostile 2v1 situation with Sweden and Sevastopol in the north, or he would likely get jittery. England asked that I not build a fleet in the north, and I complied so we could establish a neutral north. So this is one way that you can start to establish an area on the map where you're not actively fighting a war. My position in Sweden is very fragile since I have essentially committed to the south, and so I'm relying completely on the goodwill of both England and Germany to keep Sweden, and of course on my own diplomatic skills to negotiate that I keep that. And here's what Brandon noted about this choice.
It's a peculiar arrangement, I think, especially given the Russians' moves. Moscow staying in place when I think you'd much rather have the army stay in St. Petersburg and do something up there and move Moscow either to Livonia or Ukraine, something like that here. It could be a very long-term slow play on Russia's part, but it certainly lacks efficiency if we're just looking from a purely tactical perspective. So we'll keep an eye on that, whether that tells us something about Randy's style of play or about the possible alliance structure.
So he's absolutely right on all counts. This is a slow play, and I'll continue to move this piece back and forth for a number of years. A little bit of a dance going on here. If Sam were to slip into Norway, he would not get the capture, and I would reclaim it with Moscow's help, and then I would know that our neutrality in the north was done. But Sam was happy to keep this arrangement so that my main force would go south, and he could focus on eliminating France fast. This worked to both our advantages. Fall 1902 was a major turning point in the game. There was very limited amount of time to make this decision. As you can see, Turkey has fully withdrawn from his mainland and has left himself very vulnerable. I was fully intending on working with him here against Austria, but I had a very brief conversation with Natty, and somehow I completely changed my entire course and committed the first brutal stab of the game.
The Turk facing severe difficulties here. I expected it to be a juggernaut, but I suppose Russia really had a lot of the power in that situation because Turkey had already committed to the south, and Russia could take Austrian support or Turkish support there. And getting into Black Sea is going to be devastating for the Turk, as long as Austria sticks with Russia.
This strikes me as the first brutal stab we've seen, and it's nice to see brutal stabs in Carnage scoring, which doesn't often encourage them, but. Yeah, I mean, look, this is so this is so awful for Turkey. This would have worked. The convoy from Smyrna into Greece would have worked, but for the tapping on Bulgaria. So Turkey, Russia clearly made the calculation here that removing the Turkish threat now is worth more than the possible benefits of sticking with the RT given the board setup. Do you guys like that? Do you like that call, Siobhan?
This really smacks of some really good diplomacy on Austria's part, I think, because the realignment of all the Russian units, Livonia is going back to St. Pete, we're seeing a lot more movement, so I think this is really, on Natty's part in Austria, just an A+ job of convincing the Russian to do what you wanted.
Siobhan is absolutely correct here. At the time, I had no clue why I switched course. All I knew was that the Austrian had convinced me to do it, and that's the main reason I wanted to do this video, to slow moments like these down and really look at how this happened and why I decided to go the way I did. So I asked Natty after the game was done how he did this, and he says to me, "I can't speak to your mindset, but I pointed out a couple of things to you. First off, your stab couldn't be stopped. Even if Turkey had anticipated it, there was nothing he could do to stop you from taking Bulgaria and entering the Black Sea. The second was that I was generally a good ally and I stick by people." And I didn't know at the time how good George is at this game, a true Windy City weasel with lots of experience, but in retrospect, I think I was lucky to go for the jugular here and eliminate this threat early. Sorry, George. The commentators were quite perplexed by my fleet build.
I'm sorry. So builds, we have a rather surprising fleet Sevastopol build. Seems like you don't need the fleet since you're already in the Black Sea. But again, Randy has surprised us, so keep surprising us, Randy.
So my rationale is that I have a chance to get a second fleet, which I'll need if I'm with Austria and pushing out into the Aegean. If I keep one fleet in reserve in the Black Sea, I'm adjacent to 5 centers, which makes this space, the Black Sea, the most valuable one on the map, especially if I'm Russia and I conquer Turkey. One unit can cover so much area. So the downside is that I can't move from Armenia to Smir, but I'm actually planning to relinquish one center to Austria because I can't defend Romania and Bulgaria anyways, and I get that army into Armenia. It's a bit of a risk, but it's slightly unconventional, which may throw off some seasoned players, and it also buys me some credibility with Austria, who I'm hoping I can stick with in the long run here. But here's where you get the real measure of a player. I have nothing but the utmost respect for Turkey here because he doesn't get mad, he doesn't swear at me or accuse me, even though I would absolutely deserve it. He simply says, in 1903, George says, "I immediately pitch a janissary position to Russia, which he eventually agrees to once I'm in the Ionian and no longer a threat. I think there was initially reluctance to not just kill me outright, but pointing out that neither Russia or Austria would get more points due to carnage by eliminating me, and by being useful, by being a fleet behind Italy's lines, gave me enough leverage for Russia to agree to keep me alive." George is a very classy player and one who never gives up.
Tell us what you see.
Okay, so Russia convoys Bulgaria over to Armenia, which is pretty great, given that it gets you that army in Armenia. That's a very nice unit to have there when you're attacking Turkey, but it does beg the question, why didn't you just build army Sevastopol and then move that there instead? Because then you wouldn't have had to convoy your army out. Austria and Russia continuing their alliance here. Austria pushing into Bulgaria, presumably to continue to try and push into Constantinople or to cut Constantinople so that Russia can hopefully take Ankara, but that isn't guaranteed here.
In every diplomacy game, it doesn't matter how long you've been allies or who you're working with. If someone gets a chance to improve their fortunes, they'll stab you. When I work with an ally, I always try to make sure that I know what they want. Is it revenge? Do they want to grow by one center? Do they want to build a fleet? Do they just want to hunker down and survive? In this case, Natty wanted to both hunker down and survive, and he also wanted to slowly grow one center at a time. So one of my goals was to cede centers to him as I claim them so that we could keep from being too imbalanced. He didn't need to stab me if I'm willingly handing over to him and my centers and maintaining an alliance that way. So it's often very important to keep allies fairly balanced if you're looking for solidarity.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely an interesting thing here. You see the two odd men out in the east, which are Italy and Turkey, who can't really work together very effectively because, well, they don't really have any position to attack Austria, and Austria has so many armies that it's pretty impossible to do anyway. So they're just going, oh, let's work together somewhere else instead. Let's just like all go off to Spain and take them instead.
So here's why Natty told me he didn't stab me here. As for the lack of a stab, I don't think there was a good moment to stab you. You had stuck by me, helped me grow, and I didn't see how a stab would benefit me. It might have helped someone else top the board, but it wouldn't have helped me. Austria is in a precarious position. There was a moment on the YouTube broadcast by Diplomacy Broadcast Network where the commentators thought I might have stabbed you, but it was a spring term and you didn't seem to have any enemies. To me, that said, you would have had a whole other movement phase to retaliate, and you could have pulled units from other fronts to defend your position.
All right, I was half expecting Austria to stab Russia here, because it was pretty clear that Russia's overall plan had to be, after that fleet build, pushing those fleets out. So that's the only reason you build the second fleet there, because you're going to push it out through Constantinople. So Russia was really all in on the Austrian, but I don't think the Austrian was all in on Russia. They could have taken Romania here, they could have got a decent position on the Russian homeland, and because Russia has all these fleets, they can't defend it very well.
If you are Russia here, do you stab Austria?
I think, having seen that Austria didn't stab me that turn, I would assume that Austria is going to stick with me, because that's the turn I think Austria would have made the move if they were going to. But I could see, I think it makes more sense to take Smyrna here and push those fleets out, but I could see reason for stabbing Austria as well, given that's where you would push if you're going to build armies here.
So the commentators also ask here if I should stab Austria, but that wasn't really an option since Austria was my only real ally, and he had proven to be both a strong and a loyal player. Once again, my approach here left the commentators somewhat perplexed, and for good reason.
And, oh, of all of Russia's possible moves in Asia Minor, that was not on the set that I was considering. Marcus, tell us about it.
Okay, I think it's a negotiated thing between Russia and Turkey, saying, okay, you can keep your fleet in the Gulf of Leon and keep harassing the Westerners for me, and I'll just leave you alive here and take your center whenever I feel like it, or whenever you get something in Iberia. And Turkey doesn't really have a choice there; they just have to go with it. We see the Austria-Russia still sticking together to the extent that Austria is just backing out of Budapest there.
So Brandon's absolutely right here. I decided to take a ridiculous risk of keeping Turkey on the board because I liked that he was harassing the Western powers and stirring up conflict over there, and also because I have 7 centers and I don't want to scare Austria, England, and Germany into launching a full offensive against me if they perceive that I'm going to top the board. So my idea here is to fly under the radar, not be as noticed, but be in a position where I can take control of the board when I want or need to. To return to Germany for a moment, he makes a key decision to drop a fleet in Kiev here, and this definitely increased tensions with England because now Germany is signaling that he wants some naval supremacy. And here's what Germany was thinking at the time. He says, England continually insisted I tap Sweden, which caused some tension when I didn't want to do that without negotiating it with Russia first. Eventually, France fell, but Italy got most of those dots. Without a common target, tensions between England and I grew, and eventually we slowed each other down a bit. This was really working to my advantage, and this is also where I began communicating more actively with Germany, because it was essential that Germany and England have each other to worry about rather than teaming up to take me on. In the spring of 1905, Marcus was observing that I appeared to be setting up a stab Austria, but this wasn't actually in my plan.
So it looks like this Austria-Russia is sticking together at first glance, but that move, Ankara to Constantinople, is very interesting instead of pushing the second fleet out into the Mediterranean, because with that, even with the second fleet, it's very unlikely that they managed to break Italy's defenses down here, so... But at least they had a chance that way. This looks like it's setting up for Russia to be able to stab Austria next turn. But Austria should see that coming, so we'll see how that turns out.
Well, and if
I was certainly locking down my holdings in Turkey, and I also made a move on England here. This was the point where I decided I needed to grow. I was ahead on centers for the entire game, but only ever by 1, and I knew that my opponents would start to focus on me as soon as I hit 10 centers. So we arrive at spring 1905 when the commentators really pile on to my questionable orders. Turkey and I came to an agreement here that would leave Smyrna open on the condition that he waive the build. And this is a massive risk, and perhaps it's one that I shouldn't have taken, but part of this game is getting a read on players and a feel for what you think you can pull off and how far you can push the envelope. And my read on George at this point was that he'll follow through on his promises, and that would also help to keep me under the radar. George sold that to me, and it worked out. Here's the reaction of the DBN to George's waved build.
If you don't take Smyrna this in the fall here, you're going to have a new unit over here.
That's true.
Yeah.
That could be a real problem.
I think the Russian moves combined with the Italian moves say that an Austrian stab is coming, but he really needs to take Smyrna.
Yeah, I agree with you now. I mean, last time I was like, oh, maybe it's good to get the jump on Austria, but now you can't let a wild card Turkish unit in there. And let's see whether Russia agrees. Marcus, does Russia agree?
Russia just gives Romania to the Austrian, and doesn't take Smyrna.
Yeah.
What is Russia doing?
Randy.
I mean, like, let's give Randy some. Let's try to give Randy some credit here. This looks to me like the moves of a relatively inexperienced player. I think that's been consistent most of this game, and a really creative and interesting stuff in a lot of moments. But then at other moments, simply passing up opportunities or even going backwards, which you see from beginners in a lot of places. So apologies, Randy, if you're not a beginner. So hopefully you've done some really cool stuff this game. This is definitely not an optimal turn.
So I think part of why these orders look so odd is that the blind commentary doesn't account for the relationships you've built up in the press. Austria and I are looking for a first and a second place here, and if he stays happy and if we stay together, there's no stopping us. This is why I gave up a center to him. It looks like a noobish mistake to be ceding control when I'm in a power position, but in terms of my experience level in the game, they're actually completely bang on and also incredibly off. So I've played the game for over 30 years, but I've never played in a virtual face-to-face and never in a tournament. And these are two very different situations than playing on Backstabber over a series of weeks. So the best part of this commentary is that I'm currently in a Media Wars game playing as allies with Marcus, and he's completely unaware of this fact. I'm Austria in that game, and he's Russian. The first 4 years of that game have played out almost identically to this one, but since I entered this game under my real name rather than as Legendary Tactics, no one actually knew who I was. But I'm actually glad for that, because I wanted to see a completely neutral commentary of the gameplay from the perspective of what an enemy or an opponent might see on the board based on my moves.
So Austria picks up 2 dots and can't put
Anything down. Yep.
Oof. Okay.
So, and I'm just guessing that George is cackling with glee that he gets to build something right now.
All right, fleet or army, real quick.
Please be an
Army, obviously.
Yeah.
Waved. No.
Oh.
George. Why?
No.
Was that on? Someone in that game, was that on purpose or did he misorder?
So whereas England was looking really strong in the early game, the rogue Italian fleet and the Janissary Turkish fleet are really doing a fine job distracting him and preventing him from launching an attack on me in the north for fear of losing his home centers. Tensions were also building with Germany at that point, and Germany and I continued to work together. I was also working very hard to keep Germany and England in a conflict. Sorry, Sam. Had this game gone on much longer, I would have had to attack either Germany or Austria here. From a board perspective, it certainly would have made a lot of sense to go for the Austrian, but he was also a loyal ally and we'd built up a lot of trust, so I can't actually say which direction I would have gone there.
Okay, and Russia gets the army down. So we're sitting at the beginning of 1907 with Russia on top with 9. I mean, how great is it going to be? I can tell you this game is going to end in 1907. So looking at the moves here, is there any reason not to think that it's heading for an ending? I don't see it. So Russia, man, Randy Thompson, we just gave you a whole bunch of junk.
But, we can't argue the results.
You can take that junk and throw it right back in our faces and smear it, because you topped this board. And for the wacky stuff that you did that looked at times curious and inefficient to us, You mastered this board. Congratulations, man.
At the end of the game, Sam said that he'd never played in a game like this in 2 years, and perhaps my off-meta approach mucked with the traditional dynamics of the game, but I think that the human element in every game means that you can't ever reliably predict what will happen and what decisions people will make. While this game could have gone horribly wrong for me in any number of places, I ended the board as a board top here mostly through the early surge by taking Turkey, then forging a strong and loyal alliance with Austria, and also by not causing too much offense to all the other players.
That is it for game board number 2, Paoli. Thank you guys for playing, and congratulations again to Randy Thompson for making us eat a whole bunch of crow. And we look forward to seeing you in round 2, and also being made to look stupid. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's why I do these things.
All right.
Thanks so much to the DBN, Siobhan, Marcus, and Brandon for their work. If you haven't stabbed the subscribe button, now's your chance. And thanks for your time and for watching the video.